Sci-fi, horror, fantasy, absurdism in the extreme. It's all available here in the Tales from the Omni Vault book series. Check the description for Amazon links so you can get your copies and start reading today. Thank you all, and now, on to the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Viewer, and welcome to this Halloween edition of Genre Benders, Obscurities, and Flawed Gems, where we look at the spookiest stuff you've never heard of. Today, though, our subject is highly unconventional, to say the least. One of the most infamous incidents associated with Halloween is the Mercury Theater War of the Worlds broadcast, orchestrated by Orson Welles. Thanks to how the novel was adapted as a news broadcast, people who tuned in late thought they were hearing reports of a real invasion from Mars, causing nationwide panic. Or so the legend goes. Nowadays it's believed the so-called panic was exaggerated by the press and wasn't nearly as widespread. Whatever the case, the broadcast's reputation lives on to this very day, influencing many future works across multiple mediums in one form or another. In fact, I have my suspicions that it might have held influence on today's movie, which is something you might not even remember unless you're a really big fan of the studio that made it, or a really big fan of the band that provided the music. For your consideration, I present Bad Channels. The K-Dull radio network is going national and upgrading from lame polka music to trendy rock and roll. Behind this change is Dan O'Dare, a shock jock infamous for pulling stunts that push the limits of what he can get away with, sometimes going too far. It's a big deal that everyone is tuning in for, and even the Cable World Network is covering it as a special interest story. Everyone is loving the debut show, in which Dan claims he is trapped in the studio with aliens who are using the broadcast to abduct women through the airwaves, and he's powerless to stop it. The thing is, it's not an act. Aliens really have taken over the studio to abduct women, and Dan is struggling to keep his sanity intact since nobody believes him. Bad Channels was produced by Full Moon Features, a studio that predominantly focused on producing direct-to-video sci-fi and horror. Technically, they're still active today, but their glory days were in the 80s and 90s. If you grew up in the age of video rental stores, you were quite familiar with Full Moon's many titles, which ran the gamut from gothic horror to kaiju eiga. They even made a Doctor Strange movie in everything but name years before the MCU ever existed. It's called Dr. Mordred if you want to look it up, and yes, that is Jeffrey Combs in the lead role.
Would you say Full Moon is to the 80s and 90s what the Asylum is to us today?
Oh, good heavens, no. I mean, sure, the basic idea of producing indie genre flicks is kind of the same, but Full Moon movies always had a better quality, even if they could still be pretty schlocky. And speaking of schlock, you're probably wondering where Bad Channels falls on that particular spectrum. Well, something you need to know going in is that this movie is a sci-fi horror comedy, a combination of genres that can be tricky to nail. Fortunately, this movie pulls it off. The comedy is the heaviest early on, before the sci-fi elements kick in, at which point the comedy doesn't disappear, but it is downplayed and mixed in with the horror elements. Obviously, when your main character is a shock jock, someone who makes his living through audacity and irreverence, there's going to be a sense of humor attached to the proceedings. At the same time, though, Dan O'Dare really is in a frightening, desperate situation, and the movie does not pretend otherwise. He's trapped with a pair of strange extraterrestrials who don't seem to care that he's there, but they're happy to use him as a tool for their goals. Just to make matters worse, Dan's cries for help are undone by his own reputation, since everybody thinks he's just putting on a show, albeit a very convincing one. Even as he does draw attention to the studio, nobody actually thinks he's in trouble or dealing with aliens. If anything, they think he's gone insane and is keeping hostages with him. Adding to the horror is the mysterious nature of the aliens. These guys maintain an air of mystery throughout the movie, and even as they engage in a bit of slapstick themselves, that mystery naturally mixes with menace. Neither one speaks in a comprehensible language, and the way they go about the studio without ever really acknowledging Dan lends them an almost Lovecraftian attitude of indifference. Naturally, we also have no idea why they're abducting women from across the nation. The main alien, Cosmo's behavior when he greets his shrunken prizes in their glass prisons implies that he wants to keep them as pets, but we really have no idea what his intentions are. It gets even stranger when we learn that Cosmo isn't even humanoid like he first appears, but as actually a weird Audrey 2-like plant creature. It never gets too creepy, mind you, because it is still a comedy, but it does get just creepy enough. I'm sure my eagle-eyed audience recognized the title Bad Channels from my Blue Oyster Cult album retrospective, since the soundtrack was one of the albums I covered. Now, the choice to have Blue Oyster Cult do the soundtrack was not an accident, because this movie's identity is heavily steeped in rock and roll. As far as the BOC score itself, I previously described it as ambient rock, which is a huge departure from the band's usual style, even taking their versatility into account. Basically, don't expect something on the same bombastic level as what Queen composed for Flash Gordon. That said, the music certainly fits every scene, and it never lets you forget how important rock music is to the proceedings.
To be clear, rock isn't just important because the movie is set at a radio station.
The way Cosmo abducts women, as far as any of us can tell, requires him to synchronize the broadcast with his target's brainwaves. This causes them to hallucinate that they're in a music video, only to be teleported when the song ends.
And yes, that means we can upgrade the genre to sci-fi horror comedy musical, now that we have 3 music videos occurring during the runtime. Strangely, Blue Oyster Cult was not one of the bands featured in the music video, despite being so integral to the rest of the movie, but I guess that's just as well, as it allows the spotlight to be shown on other bands that fell into obscurity afterwards. The first band to appear in a mental music video is Fair Game with the song Blind Faith. This is a hair metal act fronted by prolific singer Ron Keel, backed by an all-female band. They've got a bit of a Bon Jovi sound, but not to the point where they're just flatly imitating Bon Jovi. The lyrics themselves are pretty decent, exploring the premise of blind faith and the dangers of leaning on it rather than applying critical thinking, so it's not a mindless song by any stretch. The second video features DMT playing Touching Myself Again, and it's a low point for me. DMT throws a little grunge into the mix, but unfortunately, it's bad grunge. They're aiming for Nirvana, but they landed on latter-day Pearl Jam. I'd play an excerpt for you to show what I mean, but I don't want to subject you guys to it. Plus, if you couldn't tell from the title, the lyrics aren't exactly family-friendly, assuming you can even understand them. I guess you can count this one as a built-in bathroom break. It lasts just long enough to tap a kidney, and by the time you're back, you haven't missed anything.
That's certainly one way to spin it. Last up is Psychotic Symphony with the song Manic Depresso. This act is hard to describe. Imagine if the Alice Cooper Band and Pee-wee's Playhouse got thrown into a blender, and you'll have something like Psychotic Symphony. They've got ridiculous costumes, music that wavers between light and heavy on a whim, and by the end you're left confused but also intrigued. The song itself follows a similar theme as the Happy Happy Joy Joy song from Ren and Stimpy, but without the need to dance around network censors, so it's a bit more intense.
Unfortunately for each of these bands, Bad Channels is the biggest thing that happened to any of them. Not for Ron Keel, he's got plenty of projects under his belt. Fair Game was just one of many.
True, but as individual bands, they were one-album wonders. Actually, if you look hard enough, you can find the individual albums that each band released, although you're more likely to find them in a digital form. Physical copies are exceedingly rare these days. Now I know what you're thinking. The idea of playing an entire music video before the girls get abducted feels very weird, and if you think too hard about it, the concept might not even make sense. Even that explanation Snazzy provided earlier is merely a fan theory since we don't really know anything about the aliens, and that includes their methods.
But then again, who really cares? That just makes Bad Channels a unique viewing experience.
I can genuinely say that I've never seen a movie take this approach before. There are plenty of movies that play into the idea of rock and metal being satanic, but none come to mind that take a sci-fi approach, and certainly not one like this.
Having covered all of this, I'm sure some of you looked up the movie to try learning more, and noticed it's rated R. Now, why is it rated R, you may wonder? Well, with these direct-to-video movies, you can never be too sure, can you? They tended to really up the mature content, particularly when it came to gore and even nudity. However, Bad Channels doesn't have any extreme content like that.
The violence against humans isn't especially gory, and creature violence doesn't contribute to R ratings.
There is some suggestive dialogue and skimpy outfits, but nothing explicitly sexual either. So getting back to that question, why is it rated R?
The F word?
Yep, that's the reason. You see, as Dan becomes more unhinged, he starts saying words you can't say on the radio. Even this, however, is born out of his desperation, because he hopes that breaking such rules will spur the police, or get an airstrike ordered, or heck, make something happen. There's context to why these words are used, rather than just having them be used liberally throughout as a poor substitute for clever writing. In short, the only reason the movie is rated R is because of multiple uses of strong language that are actually contextualized, which means they're not gratuitous. And in a way, that kind of makes it feel pointless. I mean, can you imagine if something like that was done in a modern theatrical movie? Bet you weren't expecting that comparison to be made when you started watching. Unfortunately, Bad Channels has a bad reputation. Most reviews you'll find will call it a mess, a mistake, and any other kind of critique they can level against it. Personally, though, I don't see where all the hatred comes from. I mean, there's no denying that the movie is very different from the norm, even when that norm is limited entirely to Full Moon's catalog. Few movies made outside of India have random breaks for music videos, sure, and the premise itself is just strange on the face of it. That said, I've seen far stranger premises that I haven't had a hard time accepting, and I don't have a hard time accepting this one either. Frankly, I don't see how anybody could have a hard time accepting it unless they just weren't willing to meet the movie on its own terms. Bad Channels isn't just weird, it's interesting, and it's a movie that any fan of sci-fi and rock and roll should watch at least once. Heck, there are plenty of Full Moon movies that are worth checking out, some of which are finally seeing the light of day after years of languishing unfinished in the vault, but Bad Channels stands out as unique among them. Like I said at the start, it's unconventional viewing, either for Halloween or any day of the week, but it's also a movie I don't think you'll forget after seeing it. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer wishing you all a happy Halloween. You know, Snazzy, I can't help but feel like I forgot something. Well, you forgot that Bad Channels exists in the same universe as other Full Moon series like Doll Man and Demonic Toys, making it one of the few cinematic universes that exists in the direct-to-video market. Oh, hey, that's right. Well, maybe I'll look into those details another day.